Hey, book lovers. My name is Em, and I want to talk about books. And cats. Welcome back, book lovers. Once again, this episode is late. It has been a hell of a week. We are down to no functioning cars. Well, we have one that functions, but you have to put water in it every time you drive it. And today, the other car broke down while we were about an hour or so from our house. So it's been an eventful week, and I'm just happy I got to read a book at all. And what a book it was. So let's get right into it. Today I want to talk about Ghost Summer, Stories by Tananarive Due. And I'm so sorry if I messed up your name. So first I have to say, wow. I have been missing out on this book for an entire year. I bought this on a whim last summer, mostly because it had summer in the title and it was a collection of short stories. I really didn't know much else about it. I then proceeded to leave it on my to-read shelf for a year, until this past week, actually. And once I had finished it, in one sitting, of course, I realized just how much I had been missing out. I love books, and I read a lot of good ones. But every once in a while, I close a book, and I am completely overcome with just every emotion. And this was one of those times. This book absolutely consumed me, and when I was done, I was kind of convinced for a little bit that I should just give up writing because I was never going to write anything like these stories. Now, I have chilled out a bit since then. I have banished the imposter syndrome back to the shadows of my mind, where it can stay until it decides to come out again. So, no, I can never write something like the stories in this book. I don't have experiences like these, so I will just keep plugging away in my own writing lane. I enjoy my magical, fantastical worlds, and it doesn't help anyone to compare themselves to others. Anyway, this book is broken down into sections: Gracetown, The Knowing, Carriers, and Vanishings. I think this is probably the best way to discuss this book. Short fiction is kind of a challenge to talk about because I want to convey what makes the story so good, but I also don't want to ruin the stories for anybody else. So I'll do my best. Ruined or not, read this book because the writing is amazing. You can really feel like the heavy summer heat in Florida, which is where the book begins, with stories set in Gracetown. Now, Gracetown, well, summers are a little strange there. They bring odd happenings, and nobody swims in the lake in the summer. Ghosts visit local kids regularly, and sometimes those ghosts have unfinished business. This first section has 3 incredible stories, all set in Gracetown, and you will be hooked immediately. The first story, The Lake, was so excellent that I had to close the book for a moment and just soak it in when I finished. The note from the author on this one is really interesting, but definitely don't read those first because it'll give away the surprise. The second section is called The Knowing. This part was just excellent. I love the idea of someone having a gift or a curse, especially if it involves some sort of physical transformation. Although, my favorite story in this section didn't actually involve any sort of physical change. It was just having the knowing, which is a very cruel gift to possess. It was so good. I don't want to say anything else, but it's so good. The third section was called Carriers. There are 5 stories, and they're all surrounding a viral outbreak pandemic. Little too close to home, right? We start out with a story of Patient Zero, and then the stories kind of take place during and then after the outbreak. It's a really fantastic group of stories, and I highly recommend that you sit and read this section all at once. It's so fantastic, and it really has some great characters, and it explores how people react under extreme duress and how it can affect them later on. It's really fantastic. And then finally, the last section is called Vanishings. There are only 2 stories in this section, and they explore 2 very different endings of life. These are some really thoughtful pieces. They explore grief and denial and acceptance. It's really a beautiful ending to an absolutely incredible book. I just love short fiction. I feel like it's much more difficult to write than longer fiction, at least to write it really well. Do you guys have any short stories that really speak to you? Send me some titles. I would love to read some more good short fiction. I love a quick read. Plus, I find sometimes that short fiction is able to present a really interesting idea or moment without having to get bogged down in the details and the background. You kind of just have to accept everything at face value as it is. And I just like that. It's like capturing a scene. One scene. Anyway, buy this book, Ghost Summer, stories by Tananarive Due. This book is just incredible. If you go to my website, booksandcatspod.com, you can find links to purchase this book and other books that I've discussed in episodes. And if you use the link, you're helping support the podcast. So let's talk about my cats. My furry duo has been up to quite a bit of mischief lately. Sassers, the smaller but somewhat smarter one, has figured out how to open our basement door. And the last 2 nights they have gotten down there, and then they have managed to sneak outside. Now, considering this is how we lost Strudel, this is very concerning. But so far they have kept to the backyard and haven't been near the road. Still, don't love it. I don't think Sassers is like super into it. She's usually yowling to be let in pretty soon after she goes outside. Edward, on the other hand, would spend hours just running around in the grass. And the last couple of nights, he has added hunting to his repertoire. He has brought Andy a dead rodent 2 mornings in a row, and he is so very proud of himself. It's really adorable, even though I wish he would stop going outside. We are getting a lock for the basement door. And speaking of locks, for my first quote of the week, I went with one involving locks, in honor of the basement, I guess. I don't know. I just liked it. It's from Shannon L. Alder. We are chained by our own control. Life is nothing more than finding the key that unlocks every part of our soul. I just like that one. And then, right when I was finishing up the notes for this episode, I found a Judy Blume quote. And I just adore Judy Blume. I honestly should really reread some of her stuff and talk about it, because she was everything when I was growing up. Anyway, here's an amazing quote from my favorite author from when I was a kid. It's inspiring stuff. Each of us must confront our own fears, must come face to face with them. How we handle our fears will determine where we go with the rest of our lives, to experience adventure or to be limited by the fear of it. Right on, Judy Blume. Yes, no fear. Anyway, on that note, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I have a new chapter of my weekly writing project, Ocean Eyes. Be right back. Welcome back, book lovers. So it's time for a new chapter of my weekly writing project, Ocean Eyes. This is a story that is coming straight from my brain to you without any editing. And this week is Chapter 8. I hope you enjoy. Nim rose from the river in a shower of diamond-like droplets. They glittered around her and illuminated her pale beauty. Her bluish skin took on a silvery sheen as she burst into the sunlight. It was an impressive entrance, worthy of the queen of the river dwellers. It would have made such an impression, if anyone had been there to see it. Kevo was late, or maybe he wasn't coming at all. She had called to him in a moment of uncharacteristic weakness. She sent him a vision. He'd agreed to meet her, yet she sensed a resistance in him. Maybe he had decided not to help her after all. Where is he? Her closest friend and assistant, Sephi, stood beside her. Their newly formed legs carried them against the current to the stony shore. She saw her friend flinch as her sensitive new flesh stepped onto the sharp stones of the riverbed. Nim didn't answer. There was no point. Keva wasn't hiding behind a tree somewhere. He had abandoned her. There was no time to get emotional about it. She needed to think. Sephi, however, stood with her hands on her hips, dripping beautifully in the golden sun. She scowled at Nim and waited impatiently for an answer. I don't know, Nim finally replied. She hated the little quiver in her voice. He said he'd be here. Sephi shook her head and took in their surroundings. As she turned in a slow circle, Nim moved to the large, water-smooth tree trunk that lay on the edge of the river. She sat down warily and put her head in her hands. She could feel Sephi's eyes on her. They had been friends for decades. Nim met her almost immediately after her triumphant return. The remaining river dwellers returned to the wreckage that the dark-hearted ones had left behind. Still, they celebrated their newfound freedom. Everyone was just happy to be out of hiding. There were more survivors than Nim had known, and there were many happy reunions in those first days following the planting of the peace tree. Nim was overjoyed for her people, but it was a lonely time for her. The task of rebuilding her family's realm was daunting, and she spent the nights swimming in circles around the main ballroom of her falling castle. Her room was still intact, but the ballroom was missing a large chunk of wall. At night she could turn her face upward and see the stars far above. Her heart yearned for her dry land family, but once the task was complete, the cousins had nothing left to bind them. They quickly went in their own directions, and she was left behind in the water. She missed her sister greatly at that time. Cerise had given her life for their people. She had been so much more dedicated to the magic of the river. She would have been a powerful queen. Cerise always had a plan. She knew what to do. Nim could have used the guidance. She turned instead to the night sky, as if the air somehow held the answers she searched for. Sephi appeared in the ballroom one night. Nim's eyes were again turned skyward, and a slim shadow passed over the moonlight. She circled back and slipped through the missing wall, but she hesitated just inside the palace. Who are you? Nim asked, in a voice that sounded so much stronger than she felt. Sephi laughed and swam closer. Her eyes were a silvery green and seemed to glow in the moonlight. I wouldn't expect you to remember me, but I was quite close with your sister, Cerise. She used to swim downstream to visit me. I miss her terribly. I came here to, I don't know, say goodbye. Nim's heart hurt when she thought of her wild and fearless sister, of Cerise's sacrifice, and her own inability to do the same. Sephi and Nim had talked long into the night, and every night for a month after. Nim's new friend joined her in the new castle, and they had been inseparable ever since. Sephi had helped Nim rebuild the realm over the decades, and the River Queen was eternally grateful. Now her friend stood impatiently waiting in the sunshine. Her body gave off steam as the sun baked her skin. Nim needed to make a decision. Quickly. Kevo snapped awake when the ice-cold water hit his face. He sat dripping and blinking in the bright green light. Then he tried to move. His arms were bound behind him, and his ankles were held tight to the legs of the chair. He shifted his weight and tried to tip the chair, but a hand on his shoulder stopped him. Hey, man, relax. Kevo knew the voice. His stomach dropped. This was not where he was supposed to be. He had hoped to never enter this forest again. Lazalt stepped in front of him and grinned. He had aged, but his skin was still smooth and green. Only a few wrinkles around his eyes showed the passage of time. Welcome back, man. Long time. Kevo grunted, but he didn't respond. Lazalt's grin wavered just a little. He sighed and shook his head. Look, I know this is a less than warm welcome, but it's been decades. I wasn't sure how you'd react. You kidnapped me, Kevo grunted. How should I react? Come on, Kev. Kidnapped? Calm down. I just want to talk. It's been so long. Let's catch up. He pulled another chair over and sat facing Kevo. Here's the thing. I know you have no interest in having any more magic in your life. I get it. I've stayed away all these years so you could have a normal life. The valley's a magical dead zone now. Not a speck of magic for years upon years now. Lazalt stood up and walked to the window. The sunlight showed through the walls and gave his face an even greener tinge. He looked younger, as he had when Kevo first encountered him, when they had been friends. I have my own people watching the valley, even now when nothing has happened in decades. Nim's message lit up the entire place. There was no missing it. It was very careless of her. Dangerous. Lazalt turned back to him. I just want to help, Kev. There are others. Some you've never even heard of. And they've been watching too. There are things happening behind the scenes. Something bad is coming to the valley, and we need your help. Kevo closed his eyes and leaned his head back. His hands were numb and the vines binding his wrists were cutting deep into his flesh. He took the deepest lungful of air that he could, held it, and then forced it all out in a whoosh. The sound made Lazalt jump. Untie me, Kevo grumbled. Then we can talk. I gave up trying to live a normal life when I agreed to meet Nim. Something has felt off for a while now. I want to know what's going on. A bright smile spread across Lazalt's face. He snapped his fingers, and unseen creatures with tiny, nimble fingers untied Kevo's restraints. They screamed when he stood abruptly the moment the binds loosened. He grinned and examined the bloody burns on his wrists. Yes, Lazalt exclaimed. Good to have you back, man. He embraced Kevo and thumped him on the back. He stepped back and snapped his fingers again. Two timid flybits approached. They wrapped their long, thin fingers around Kevo's wrists. He fought not to flinch at their touch. Their fingers were ice cold. Kevo watched with fascination as his skin knit itself back together. When they released him, his wrists were intact, though a greenish-white scar cut through his coppery skin and faded tattoos. The flybits bowed and floated away. There was something different about these small creatures. They were longer and thinner, with golden eyes that bulged a bit, like an insect. He didn't have time to think about it. He noted something was off and turned his attention to his old friend. All right, he sighed. Tell me everything. And that is the end of Chapter 8, book lovers. I hope you're still enjoying Ocean Eyes, my weekly writing project. I will be back next week with a new episode and a new chapter. Until next time, keep reading.